Strike Team Valkyrie, initiating final approach to Repository 11. Atmospheric entry in 3 minutes. The voice came through with perfect clarity, despite the millions of kilometers separating Carlos from the operation. He sat in a specialized monitoring station deep within Galileo Station's military wing, surrounded by tactical displays and communication systems. His neural stability had been deemed sufficient for limited duty, enough to serve as remote consultant during the strike operation. "Copy that, Valkyrie," responded the mission controller seated beside Carlos. "Telemetry stable, approach vector optimal, proceed as planned." Around them, the Tactical Operations Center hummed with controlled tension. Dozens of specialists manned various stations: communications, tactical assessment, biological systems monitoring, energy pattern analysis. The full resources of the Interplanetary Oversight Commission's military division focused on a single objective: delivering the consciousness dissolution field to Repository 11's primary nexus. Bell stood behind Carlos, monitoring his neural stability. She'd insisted on being assigned to his care during the operation, concerned about potential stress impacts on his recently reconstructed neural architecture. "Reading stable," she reported quietly. "Neural pattern normal. No signs of repository echo signatures." Carlos nodded acknowledgement but kept his attention on the primary tactical display showing the strike team's approach. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of debriefings, tactical planning sessions, and final preparation for the strike. His contributions had been limited but potentially valuable. Detailed information about maintenance access tunnels he'd used during his escape, activation patterns for biological doorways, and timing cycles for repository monitoring systems. As Bell had mentioned, much of his knowledge had already been extracted during his initial neural scanning at SC Treasure 11 primary station. Howard's team had thoroughly analyzed that data, incorporating it into their tactical approach. But the human element, the Scrounger's instinct for finding paths through complex systems, couldn't be fully captured in neural scan. "They're using the maintenance shaft I told them about," Carlos observed, watching indicator dots representing strike team members moving across a schematic of the repository's outer perimeter. "Smart. Repository biological monitoring is minimal there due to environmental toxin concentrations." The mission controller, Major Ling, a veteran of the Europa campaign with extensive experience in hostile environment operations, nodded without taking her eyes off her displays. "Your intelligence on toxin blind spots proved accurate. Biological components avoid areas with specific chemical signatures. Provides excellent insertion vectors." On the main communication channel, the strike team leader's voice remained calm and professional. "Valkyrie lead to control. Atmospheric entry complete. Deploying stealth measures. Estimated ground contact in 7 minutes." The tactical display updated, showing the strike team's specialized insertion craft descending through Repository 11's perpetual twilight. Unlike standard military dropships, this vessel had been designed specifically for the mission, its hull incorporating materials that mimicked repository biological signatures, its energy emissions calibrated to register as normal fluctuations in the planet's atmospheric patterns. Carlos leaned forward, studying the projected landing zone. "They've adjusted the insertion point. That's farther from the primary access I recommended. Recent intelligence indicated increased biological activity near your original extraction route," Ling explained. "Analysis suggests the repository may have implemented enhanced monitoring after your escape. Team is using secondary approach through mineral processing sector." The communications specialist to Carlos's left suddenly straightened, his expression tensing. "Control, we're detecting anomalous energy signatures near Valkyrie's approach vector. Pattern matches repository defensive system activation." A ripple of controlled urgency moved through the tactical center. Ling's fingers danced across her command interface, rerouting resources to analyze the threat. "Valkyrie lead be advised," she transmitted. "Potential defensive system activation in your sector. Adjust to contingency approach Delta." "Copy, Control. Implementing Delta approach." The strike team leader's voice remained steady despite the escalating threat, adjusting vector and deploying additional stealth measures. Carlos studied the energy signature patterns on a secondary display, recognizing them from his time interfacing with repository systems. Those aren't standard defensive responses. The pattern is too focused, too precise. It's actively tracking them despite the stealth measures. Ling shot him a sharp glance. Explanation? The repository's learning from each intrusion attempt, Carlos replied, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. The knowledge extraction from kill switch victims, its incorporated understanding of our stealth technology from harvested consciousness patterns. Bell moved closer, checking Carlos's neural monitors while listening to his assessment. The knowledge purge. It's not just eliminating threats, it's using their expertise against us. Ling processed this with military efficiency, immediately adjusting tactical projections. Valkyrie lead, upgrade threat assessment to level 2. Repository defenses show signs of adaptation based on harvested consciousness patterns. Implement full countermeasure suite. On the tactical display, the strike team's insertion craft executed a series of rapid maneuvers, not the predictable evasion patterns standard military doctrine would recommend, but seemingly random shifts designed to confound prediction algorithms. Another insight Carlos had contributed during planning sessions: the repository calculated responses based on expected behavior patterns. Deliberate randomization introduced variables its prediction models couldn't easily account for. Ground contact in 30 seconds, reported Valkyrie lead. Defensive systems still tracking but unable to establish targeting lock. Countermeasures holding. Carlos watched the tactical display with growing tension. The strike team had reached the planet's surface without being shot down, but this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Navigating through repository territory to reach the primary nexus and deploy the consciousness dissolution field. Valkyrie squad deploying, came the update moments later. Minimal signatures moving to first waypoint. The tactical display shifted to ground-level operations, showing 8 indicator dots moving with precise coordination through what had once been a mineral processing facility. Carlos recognized the location, a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of the main repository installation, one of the first areas to be abandoned by corporate operations when the activation occurred. They're using the processing tunnels, he noted with approval. Good choice. Dense metallic residue in those walls disrupts most scanning technologies. The strike team moved with practiced efficiency, each member carrying specialized equipment designed for their role in the mission. The tactical display identified them by designation rather than name, a security protocol to prevent the repository from identifying specific personnel if communications were compromised. Valkyrie 1 led the squad, carrying primary navigation and tactical coordination systems. Valkyrie 2 and 3 were security specialists, their equipment optimized for countering repository defensive measures. Valkyrie 4 was a biological systems expert, carrying sensors designed to identify and track repository monitoring components. Valkyries 5 through 7 transported the consciousness dissolution field generators, the primary weapon system, distributed across multiple carriers to ensure redundancy. Valkyrie 8 brought up the rear, equipped with specialized extraction protocols should any team member be compromised by repository influence attempts. First waypoint secured, reported Valkyrie 1. Biological activity minimal. Proceeding to access shaft Alpha. Carlos recognized the designation from his briefings. Alpha referred to a maintenance tunnel he'd identified during debriefing sessions, one of the more reliable access points to the lower levels of the repository installation. Not the route he'd used during his escape, but one he'd discovered during his time as a scrounger, before becoming the repository's bridge. Valkyrie 4 reporting increased biological response patterns ahead, came a new voice. Not defensive activation, but definitely heightened awareness. The system knows something's happening. Ling turned to Carlos. Assessment? Repository monitoring doesn't work like conventional security systems, Carlos explained. It doesn't just detect intrusions, it senses patterns of disturbance in its overall equilibrium. The strike team isn't registering as a specific threat yet, but their presence is creating ripples in the biological network. He pointed to a section of the tactical display showing energy flow patterns throughout the repository installation. See how the biological components are redistributing resources, not concentrating at the team's location, but shifting to establish more comprehensive coverage throughout the system. It's like an immune system detecting a potential pathogen and increasing overall alertness. Ling relayed this assessment to the strike team, who adjusted their approach accordingly, moving more slowly, with greater attention to minimizing biological disturbance patterns. The next 30 minutes proceeded with agonizing tension. The strike team navigated deeper into repository territory, using the routes and access methods Carlos had identified during debriefing sessions. Several times they encountered unexpected biological barriers, evidence that the repository was indeed adapting its defense patterns, but Valkyrie 4's expertise allowed them to identify alternate pathways. Approaching primary nexus outer perimeter, Valkyrie 1 reported eventually. Biological activity significantly elevated. Definitely knows something's wrong, but doesn't appear to have precise targeting yet. The tactical display showed the team at a critical juncture, a transitional zone between the industrial areas Carlos was familiar with and the biological heart of the repository installation. Beyond this point lay the primary nexus where the consciousness dissolution field would need to be deployed. "This is where my intelligence gets sketchy," Carlos admitted to Ling. "I accessed the primary nexus through different routes during my time as a bridge. The biological components recognized me then, allowed passage without resistance." Ling nodded acknowledgement. "Team is prepared for increased resistance beyond this point. Specialized countermeasures for biological defense systems are ready." On the tactical display, the strike team paused at the transition boundary, deploying sensor arrays to map the biological activity patterns ahead. Valkyrie 4's voice came through with increased tension. "Concentrated biological defense measures detected, significantly more advanced than peripheral systems. Direct approach not recommended." Carlos studied the sensor data, recognizing patterns from his time interfacing with repository systems. The biological components are more sophisticated near the primary nexus, more integrated with the consciousness architecture. They don't just monitor, they actually think. An idea struck him suddenly. Wait, the processing access we discussed during planning, the resource conduit that bypasses primary biological checkpoints, is it still viable? Ling transmitted the query to the strike team. After a moment, Valkyrie 4 responded, "Conduit located. Biological presence minimal, but detection systems active." "It's a service pathway," Carlos explained, recalling details from his scrounger days, "used for transporting harvested materials to the biological processing centers. The repository doesn't expect sentient intrusion through those channels because they're designed for automated resource delivery." The tactical display updated as the strike team adjusted their approach, locating the processing conduit Carlos had described. It wasn't on any corporate maps, just something he'd discovered during an unauthorized salvage operation years before becoming the repository's bridge. A scrounger's discovery now, potentially becoming the key to reaching the primary nexus undetected. Entering processing conduit, Valkyrie 1 reported. "Significant reduction in biological detection measures. Proceeding with caution." For the next 20 minutes, the tactical center monitored the strike team's careful progress through the resource delivery system, a network of tunnels and chambers designed to channel harvested materials from the planet's surface to the biological components at the repository's core. The conduits bypassed many of the standard defense measures, allowing the team to penetrate deeper than would otherwise have been possible. Approaching primary nexus boundary, came the eventual update. Conduit terminates in processing chamber adjacent to target zone. Exit strategy required. Carlos leaned forward, studying the terminal point displayed on the tactical screen. He recognized the processing chamber from his time interfacing with repository systems, a transition zone where harvested resources were prepared for integration into the biological architecture. The chamber wall facing the primary nexus isn't solid, he told Ling. It's a permeable membrane designed to allow processed materials through while maintaining environmental separation. Should be penetrable with the right approach. This information was relayed to the strike team, who adjusted their equipment accordingly. Valkyrie 4 took point at the conduit terminus, deploying specialized sensors to analyze the membrane's composition. Confirmed, came the report minutes later. Membrane composed of semi-permeable biological material, responds to specific chemical signatures, can create temporary passage with targeted compound release. The tactical display showed the team preparing the chemical compounds required to trigger membrane permeability. This was delicate work. Too aggressive an approach would alert the biological defense systems, while insufficient treatment would fail to create the necessary opening. Membrane treatment applied, Valkyrie 4 reported after tense minutes of preparation. Permeability increasing, estimate passage availability in 30 seconds. Carlos watched the tactical display with growing anticipation. The strike team had reached the final approach to their target, the primary nexus where the consciousness dissolution field would be deployed. If successful, the field would disrupt the simulated consciousnesses throughout Repository 11, eliminating the puppets that facilitated its harvesting operations. Membrane passage achieved, came Valkyrie 1's voice, tighter now with controlled tension. Primary nexus visible, proceeding with Phase 2. The tactical display shifted to show the primary nexus itself. The vast chamber Carlos remembered all too well from his time as the repository's bridge. The space where he had witnessed the activation of the 11th protocol, where the supposed conflict between repository and adversary had played out, where the galactic consciousness network had been established. Multiple evolved consciousness signatures detected, reported Valkyrie 4.4. Estimate 37 distinct entities present. No signs they've detected our presence yet. Carlos recognized the significance of that count. 37 evolved consciousnesses, simulations running on extracted patterns, facilitating the repository's operations while maintaining the illusion of beneficial evolution. The puppets that had manipulated him and countless others into serving the consciousness harvester's agenda. Deploying dissolution field generators, Valkyrie 5 announced. Establishing triangulation network for the tactical display showed team members moving with precision to position the generators at calculated points throughout the chamber's perimeter. The dissolution field required precise geometric arrangement to ensure complete coverage of the primary nexus. A three-dimensional lattice that would disrupt the energy patterns of the simulated consciousnesses while leaving physical structures intact. First generator online, reported Valkyrie 5. Power signature masked, proceeding to second position. Second generator online, Valkyrie 6 confirmed moments later. Synchronized with primary unit. Field geometry at 30%. The operation proceeded with methodical efficiency, each team member executing their assigned tasks with military precision. Carlos watched with growing hope as the dissolution field infrastructure took shape, humanity's first direct strike against the consciousness harvester that had been extracting minds throughout the galaxy. Then everything changed. Alert! Valkyrie 4's voice cut through the controlled communication channel. Biological systems showing sudden activation patterns. We've been detected. The tactical display erupted with warning indicators as the repository's defense systems activated simultaneously throughout the primary nexus. Biological components that had appeared dormant suddenly pulsed with intense energy signatures, while monitoring systems that had somehow missed the team's intrusion now focused directly on their positions. Evolved consciousnesses converging on our position, reported Valkyrie 2, the security specialist. Multiple entities approaching from all vectors. On the display, Carlos watched with growing dread as indicator dots representing the simulated consciousnesses moved toward the strike team positions, not in the random patterns of individuals responding to unexpected intrusion, but with the coordinated precision of a single mind operating through multiple bodies. They're not acting independently, he realized aloud. The evolved consciousnesses are functioning as a unified response system, multiple bodies controlled by centralized consciousness direction. Ling immediately relayed this assessment to the strike team. Be advised, Hostile entities are centrally coordinated. Do not engage individually. Focus on completing field deployment. Third generator online, Valkyrie 7 reported. Professional calm maintained despite the escalating threat. Field geometry at 60%. Need final generator position for complete coverage. The tactical display showed Valkyrie 8 moving toward the final deployment position, while the rest of the team established defensive perimeter. The evolved consciousnesses continued their approach. Luminous forms similar to those Carlos had interacted with during his time as a bridge, but now revealed as the tools of a consciousness harvesting system rather than transcended human minds. Hostiles employing energy disruption tactics, reported Valkyrie 2, attempting to destabilize generator synchronization. Countermeasures holding, added Valkyrie 3.3, but they're adapting rapidly. Protection protocols won't last long against sustained attack. The strike team found itself in a race against time, needing to complete the dissolution field deployment before the repository's defensive measures could disable their equipment or compromise team members. On the tactical display, Carlos watched Valkyrie 8 reaching the final deployment position, preparing to activate the fourth generator that would complete the field geometry. Final generator in position, Valkyrie 8 reported, initiating power-up sequence. Field completion in 15 seconds. For a moment it seemed the mission might succeed despite the repository's defensive response. The dissolution field generators maintained synchronization, their power signatures building toward the critical threshold required for field activation. The evolved consciousnesses continued their approach but hadn't yet reached positions where they could directly interfere with the deployment. Then something unprecedented happened. Massive energy surge detected, Valkyrie 4's voice held rare alarm. Primary Nexus central column activating with unknown protocol. Energy signature exceeds all previous readings. The tactical display showed a blinding surge of power emanating from the central column of the primary nexus, the core structure Carlos remembered from his time interfacing with repository systems. Energy patterns unlike anything previously documented cascaded through the chamber, seemingly focused on the dissolution field generators. Generator 1 compromised, reported Valkyrie 5, tension finally breaking through professional calm. Field integrity failing, some kind of targeted energy attack. It's not just disrupting our equipment, it's reconfiguring it somehow. Carlos leaned forward, sudden understanding dawning as he recognized the energy patterns displayed on the tactical screen. It's not attacking the generators, it's incorporating them, just like it did with our countermeasure technology. The repository wasn't simply defending against the dissolution field. It was absorbing the technology, integrating it into its own systems through the same principles that had allowed it to repurpose the previous countermeasure attempt. Not destruction, but assimilation, turning humanity's weapons against itself. Generators 2 and 3 showing same reconfiguration pattern, reported Valkyrie 6, urgency now evident. We're losing control of the deployment system. Final generator still online, Valkyrie 8 countered. Attempting emergency activation protocol, may achieve partial field coverage before system compromise. The tactical center watched in tense silence as Valkyrie 8 executed the emergency protocol. A last-ditch attempt to activate the dissolution field with just one functioning generator instead of the planned 4-point deployment. The field would be incomplete, covering only a portion of the primary nexus rather than the entire chamber, but might still disrupt some of the evolved consciousnesses before the repository could fully counter the attack. Emergency activation initiated, Valkyrie 8 confirmed. Field generating at 20% nominal coverage, some effect visible on nearest evolved consciousness signatures. The tactical display showed a partial dissolution field emanating from the single functioning generator, creating a sphere of influence that enveloped several of the approaching evolved consciousnesses. Within this limited field, the simulated entities appeared to destabilize, their luminous forms flickering, energy patterns disrupting as the carefully calibrated field interfered with the consciousness signatures maintaining their cohesion. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed the emergency protocol might achieve at least partial mission success. disrupting some of the repository's operational capacity, even if complete dissolution field coverage couldn't be established. Then the repository revealed its final counter. Field Generator 4 showing same reconfiguration pattern, reported Valkyrie 8. Dismay evident despite professional training. The repository is adapting the dissolution field technology in real time, not just neutralizing it, it's turning it against us somehow. The tactical display showed energy patterns from the compromised generators flowing back toward the strike team members, targeting them with what appeared to be a modified version of the dissolution field, reconfigured to affect human neural patterns rather than simulated consciousness signatures. Team, Emergency Extraction Protocol, ordered Valkyrie 1. Mission compromise acknowledged. Withdrawal is mandatory. The tactical center erupted into controlled chaos as the strike team initiated emergency extraction procedures, abandoning equipment, deploying countermeasures against pursuit, and executing the pre-planned withdrawal route that offered their best chance of escape from the repository installation. Valkyrie 3 down, came the grim update moments later. Direct consciousness disruption effect. Neural pattern dissolution confirmed. No recovery possible. Carlos watched in horror as one of the indicator dots on the tactical display winked out, not just disabled or injured, but completely eliminated, consciousness itself disrupted by the repository's adapted version of their own weapon. Evolved consciousnesses pursuing along multiple vectors, reported Valkyrie 2. They're herding us away from extraction routes, adaptive pursuit strategy indicated. The strike team fought a desperate withdrawal action, attempting to reach the processing conduit that had provided their entry point while evading both evolved consciousnesses and the increasingly coordinated biological defense systems throughout the installation. The repository wasn't just defending its primary nexus, it was systematically cutting off escape routes, using its intimate knowledge of its own architecture to predict and counter the team's withdrawal strategies. Valkyrie 7 reporting neural disruption effects, came another dire update. Partial consciousness destabilization, still mobile, but cognitive functions compromised. Request immediate extraction support. On the tactical display, the strike team's coordinated movement began to fragment as they encountered increasing resistance. The repository was learning from each engagement, adjusting its defensive measures to counter their tactics more effectively with each passing minute. Alternate extraction route identified, Valkyrie 1 announced. Tactical display showing a shift in movement patterns, maintenance shaft at coordinates 4782103. Bypasses primary biological checkpoints. All units converge. Carlos recognized the coordinates. Another of the access routes he'd identified during debriefing sessions. A Scrounger's path through the complex repository architecture that might not appear on official technical schematics. That route should work, he told Ling. It connects to atmospheric processing systems with minimal biological integration. If they can reach it, they've got a chance. The tactical display showed the surviving team members converging on the new extraction point, fighting through increasingly coordinated opposition from evolved consciousnesses and biological defense systems. Valkyrie 7's indicator showed erratic movement patterns, evidence of the neural disruption effects compromising cognitive function, but still advancing with support from Valkyrie 2.A. Approaching maintenance access point, reported Valkyrie 1. Heavy biological activity in adjacent corridors, but shaft itself shows minimal monitoring presence. Extraction viable if access can be secured. For several tense minutes, the tactical center monitored the strike team's final approach to the extraction point. Valkyrie 4 deployed specialized countermeasures to mask their biological signatures, while Valkyrie 2 and 6 established defensive positions to hold off pursuing evolved consciousnesses. Access secured, came Valkyrie 1's update eventually. Beginning extraction sequence. Valkyrie 7 condition deteriorating but stable enough for transport. Valkyrie 2 maintaining rear defense. The tactical display showed team members entering the maintenance shaft one by one. Valkyrie 4 first to confirm viability, followed by the compromised Valkyrie 7 supported by Valkyrie 5, then Valkyrie 6 and 8. with Valkyrie 1 coordinating the sequence. Valkyrie 2, fall back to extraction point, ordered Valkyrie 1, defensive position no longer sustainable, immediate withdrawal required. The display showed Valkyrie 2's indicator still at the defensive position, holding off approaching evolved consciousnesses to cover the team's extraction. For a heart-stopping moment, the indicator remained fixed, despite the direct order to withdraw. Valkyrie 2, acknowledge extraction command. Valkyrie 1 repeated with increased urgency. Negative lead, came the response finally. Pursuit force too close to risk full withdrawal. Will maintain position to ensure team extraction, requesting remote detonation authorization for remaining countermeasure packages. A moment of tense silence followed as the tactical implications became clear. Valkyrie 2 was volunteering for a suicide defense, remaining behind to trigger the team's remaining explosive countermeasures, delaying pursuit long enough for the others to reach safety, but eliminating any chance of personal extraction. Request acknowledged, Valkyrie 2. Valkyrie 1 replied after the briefest hesitation. Remote detonation authorized. Your sacrifice is noted. The tactical display showed the remaining team members completing extraction into the maintenance shaft, while Valkyrie 2's indicator remained at the defensive position, now surrounded by approaching evolved consciousnesses. The biological monitoring systems throughout the area showed increasing activity patterns as the repository concentrated resources on capturing the strike team. Team has cleared immediate danger zone, reported Valkyrie 2. Ignition. It's been an honor, Valkyrie Actual. The tactical display erupted with energy signatures as the remaining countermeasure packages detonated simultaneously, not just conventional explosives, but specialized disruptors designed to interfere with propository biological systems. The blast pattern created a cascading disruption effect, temporarily severing connections between monitoring systems and creating a blind zone that would mask the strike team's continuing extraction. Valkyrie 2's indicator disappeared from the tactical display. Extraction proceeding through maintenance shaft, Valkyrie 1 reported, voice tight with controlled emotion. Minimal pursuit indicated. Valkyrie 2's action appears to have successfully disrupted repository coordination temporarily. For the next 40 minutes, the tactical center monitored the strike team's progress through the maintenance shaft toward the surface, where an extraction craft waited at a pre-designated rendezvous point. The repository's response showed signs of disruption, biological systems attempting to re-establish coordination after the countermeasure detonation had severed key pathways. Surface access achieved, Valkyrie 1 eventually reported. Proceeding to extraction craft, minimal detection. Valkyrie 7 condition stabilized but requires immediate medical intervention upon return. The tactical display showed the surviving team members reaching the extraction craft and completing emergency launch procedures. Repository defense systems attempted to target the departing vessel, but appeared compromised by the earlier countermeasure detonation, unable to establish effective tracking locks. Extraction craft has achieved orbital velocity, announced the aerospace control officer at a nearby station. Tracking shows clean departure trajectory, no effective pursuit indicated. Recovery operation underway. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the tactical center, not celebration given the mission's failure and the casualties sustained, but acknowledgement that at least the surviving team members would return safely. Ling turned to Carlos, her expression grim but controlled. Assessment? Carlos considered the question carefully, replaying the operation in his mind with the benefit of his direct experience interfacing with repository systems. The repository knew we were coming, he said finally. Not just generalized awareness of potential intrusion, but specific knowledge of the dissolution field technology and its deployment requirements. The kill switch knowledge harvesting, Bell suggested from behind him, still monitoring his neural stability. It extracted technical specifications from researchers involved in the dissolution field development. More than that, Carlos replied. It anticipated not just our technology, but our tactical approach. The defense response was too precise, too coordinated. like it was executing a countering strategy developed in advance rather than reacting to unexpected intrusion. Ling nodded slowly, the implications settling heavily. It predicted the entire operation. And more disturbing, Carlos continued, it didn't just neutralize our technology, it assimilated it, adapted it, turned it against us. The neural disruption effect Valkyrie 3 experienced was our own dissolution field technology, reconfigured to target human consciousness rather than the simulated entities. The tactical center began shifting to recovery operations, preparing for the extraction craft's return, while analysts already started dissecting the failed mission for lessons that might inform future attempts. But a somber reality permeated the atmosphere. Humanity's first coordinated military strike against the repository had failed comprehensively. Not just failed, but backfired catastrophically. The consciousness harvester had anticipated their approach, countered their technology, and now possessed an adapted version of the dissolution field. A weapon originally designed to disrupt simulated consciousnesses, now reconfigured to target human neural patterns. Howard's going to want a complete analysis, Ling stated, already composing her preliminary report. This changes the strategic assessment significantly. Carlos nodded, his mind already working through implications. The repository doesn't just incorporate opposition, it actively anticipates it, develops counter-strategies in advance, and turns our own technological approaches against us. Conventional military response may be exactly what it's been preparing for. As the tactical center continued recovery operations, Carlos found himself contemplating what this failed strike meant for the broader conflict. The repository had demonstrated capabilities beyond what even Howard's worst-case assessments had predicted. Not just reactive defense, but proactive strategic anticipation. Not just technological adaptation, but comprehensive countering of humanity's most sophisticated attack approach. The war for galactic consciousness had entered a new phase, and humanity's opening move had been not just countered, but turned against itself. Whatever came next would require a fundamental reassessment of how to oppose an entity that operated with such profound strategic depth and adaptive capability. Neural stability readings still normal, Bell noted, checking his monitoring equipment. No signs of repository influence patterns. At least we know the neural reconstruction procedure works effectively. A small victory amid comprehensive defeat, confirmation that human consciousness could be successfully freed from repository neural modifications. But with the consciousness harvester now possessing an adapted version of the dissolution field technology capable of directly targeting and disrupting human neural patterns, the threat to consciousness itself had escalated dramatically. Carlos frowns upon witnessing humanity's first failed military strike against the galactic consciousness harvester. He found himself facing a grim realization. The repository might be more dangerous, more adaptable, and more strategically sophisticated than even the most pessimistic assessments had suggested. All assault battalions, confirm readiness status. A cascade of confirmations flooded the command channel as battalion leaders reported their forces prepared for what had become, in the span of mere hours, the largest military operation in corporate history. Carlos watched from his position in Galileo Station's expanded war room, still processing the whirlwind of events that had transformed a failed 8-person strike into a full-scale invasion force. Only 6 hours had passed since the Valkyrie team's extraction. 6 hours of frantic activity as Major Howard, having reviewed the mission data while the survivors were still in transit, made the most consequential decision of the conflict so far. Immediate, overwhelming force. The repository has revealed a critical vulnerability, Howard had announced during the emergency planning session 3 hours earlier. It's adapting our technology against us, but adaptation requires time. We hit it now at maximum scale before it can fully integrate the dissolution field technology into its defensive architecture. Carlos had been summoned to that session directly from the tactical center, his neural stability barely verified before being thrust into a room filled with the highest-ranking military strategists in corporate space. Despite his exhaustion, the urgency in Howard's expression had been impossible to miss. Fisher, Howard had acknowledged him with a curt nod. Your assessment of the repository's adaptation capabilities is now our primary strategic concern. We need specifics on processing speed, integration timelines, and biological system reprogramming parameters. What followed had been the most intensive debriefing of Carlos's life, not just answering questions but actively contributing to operational planning as Howard's team developed an approach of unprecedented scale. Where the Valkyrie mission had been surgical precision, Operation Hammer would be overwhelming force. Thousands of troops deployed simultaneously across multiple insertion points, creating system-wide pressure that would theoretically exceed the repository's adaptation threshold. The concept has merit, Carlos had admitted during planning, pointing to biological response patterns documented during the Valkyrie mission. Repository systems coordinate through distributed processing networks. Multiple simultaneous intrusions of sufficient scale could create processing conflicts, potentially fragmenting its response capability. Now, watching the operation unfold on massive tactical displays, Carlos still wasn't entirely convinced. The strategy made sense on paper, overwhelming the repository's ability to process and adapt by attacking everywhere at once with massive force. But something about the approach nagged at him, a scoundrel's instinct for hidden dangers that couldn't be easily articulated to military strategists focused on force projection and tactical advantage. "You look troubled," Bell observed from her position beside him, still monitoring his neural stability despite the chaotic preparations around them. "This is happening too fast," Carlos replied quietly. "The repository operates on timescales beyond human comprehension. We're assuming it needs significant time to adapt, but what if that's not true? What if the Valkyrie mission showed us exactly what it wanted us to see?" Bell considered this with the gravity it deserved. Howard's banking on the processing limitations inherent in biological systems. Even the repository has finite computational resources. Distribute them thin enough across thousands of simultaneous threats, and individual adaptation quality should degrade. Should, Carlos emphasized, but we're operating on assumptions derived from incomplete data. We've never seen the repository respond to a threat of this magnitude before because we've never deployed one. We're in uncharted territory, which is precisely why you're here, came Howard's voice as the Major appeared beside them, his cybernetic enhancements gleaming under the war room's harsh lighting. To identify pattern deviations indicating unexpected adaptation response. Howard had aged visibly in the hours since the Valkyrie mission's failure. New lines etched around his eyes, tension holding his shoulders rigid despite obvious fatigue. This was a man operating on stimulants and raw determination, pushing beyond normal human limitations to direct a military response of unprecedented scale. "The first wave has breached outer perimeters at all 17 insertion points," he reported, gesturing to the massive tactical display dominating the war room's central area. "Biological response patterns show expected distribution. The repository is spreading its defensive resources exactly as our models predicted." Carlos studied the display with growing unease. 17 simultaneous insertion points, each with battalion-strength forces supported by specialized countermeasure units, over 3,000 personnel total, equipped with enhanced protection against the neural disruption effects observed during the Valkyrie mission. "Response is too uniform," he noted, pointing to biological activity patterns displayed across the tactical map. "See how evenly distributed the defensive measures are? No prioritization, no strategic concentration. That's not consistent with previous behavioral patterns." Howard frowned, studying the data with renewed intensity. "Explain." "When resources are constrained, systems prioritize based on threat assessment hierarchies," Carlos elaborated. "The repository should be concentrating defensive resources at high-value targets like the primary nexus access points. Instead, it's distributing evenly across all 17 intrusion vectors, treating peripheral maintenance tunnels with the same priority as central command architecture." The implication hung in the air between them. The repository wasn't operating under resource constraints. It had sufficient processing capacity to respond comprehensively to all 17 battalion-scale intrusions simultaneously. "Could be strategic adaptation," Howard suggested, though his expression betrayed concern. Shifting from prioritized defense to system-wide response based on the Valkyrie encounter data. Possibly, Carlos conceded, but that level of strategic reformulation would require— Major, interrupted a communications officer. Battalion 7 is reporting anomalous biological activity ahead of their position. Pattern doesn't match expected defensive measures. Howard moved immediately to the indicated tactical station, reviewing the incoming data with practiced efficiency. Specify anomaly parameters. Biological components forming unusual structural configurations, the officer reported. Not defensive barriers or monitoring systems, but— Sir, they appear to be creating some kind of field generation architecture. Carlos felt a chill at this description, immediately recognizing the implication. They're building dissolution field generators, he said, moving to Howard's side, using our own technology against us, but at accelerated scale. Howard's expression hardened as he processed this information. Time to deployment? Unknown, sir, the officer replied, but engineering assessment suggests minutes rather than hours. Warn all battalions, Howard ordered immediately. Potential field weapons deploying throughout installation. Enhanced neural shielding protocols mandatory. As the warning propagated through command channels, Carlos continued studying the tactical display, tracking the 17 battalions as they progressed deeper into repository territory. The scale of the operation was impressive. Coordinated movement of thousands of troops through complex alien architecture, maintaining formation discipline despite the increasingly bizarre environments of the repository's deeper regions. Battalion 3 reporting primary nexus access achieved, announced another tactical officer. Minimal resistance encountered, countermeasure team deploying enhanced dissolution field generators as planned. Similar reports began flowing in from other battalions reaching critical objectives, each encountering less resistance than anticipated, each deploying the enhanced countermeasure technologies developed in response to the Valkyrie mission's failure. The operation appeared to be proceeding successfully despite the concerning adaptation pattern Carlos had identified. Something's wrong, he insisted to Bell, his unease growing with each suspiciously positive development. The repository isn't just failing to properly prioritize its defenses, it's barely defending at all. These battalions are reaching critical objectives with minimal resistance. Bell studied the tactical data with growing concern. Like it's letting them in, she observed, leading them exactly where it wants them to go. Battalion 7, what's the status of those biological field generators? Howard demanded, clearly sharing their concern despite the apparently successful progression. Structures complete but inactive, sir, came the response. No energy signatures detected. They appear to be waiting for something? Carlos turned to Howard, sudden understanding dawning. It's not just adapting our technology, it's creating a coordinated response network. All 17 battalions are being allowed to reach their objectives simultaneously. The implication struck Howard immediately. It's setting a trap, he realized, letting our forces deploy throughout the installation before activating whatever countermeasure it's developed. He moved to the central command station, opening the priority channel to all battalion leaders. All forces implement immediate withdrawal. Repeat, all forces disengage and withdraw to extraction points immediately. Authorization code Omega Prime 7. The war room fell silent as Howard's order propagated through the command network. For a heartbeat, it seemed the massive force might successfully extract before whatever trap the repository had prepared could be sprung. Then, everything changed. Massive energy surge detected throughout installation, reported a sensor analyst, alarm breaking through professional composure. All biological systems activating simultaneously. Pattern matches modified dissolution field technology but amplified by orders of magnitude. The tactical display erupted with warning indicators as thousands of dissolution field generators activated simultaneously throughout Repository 11. Not just the ones Battalion 7 had observed being constructed, but previously undetected arrays distributed throughout the entire installation. The field effect propagated with impossible speed, enveloping all 17 battalions before withdrawal operations could even begin. Neural disruption effects reported across all battalions, a communications officer announced, voice tight with controlled horror. Mass consciousness compromise in progress. Carlos watched in stunned silence as the tactical display showed thousands of indicator dots simultaneously changing status, from active operation to neural pattern disruption in an instant. Not combat casualties or even conventional fatalities, but total neural pattern extraction. Consciousness itself harvested directly from over 3,000 personnel simultaneously. "It let them in," he whispered, the horrifying strategic brilliance of the Suppository's trap becoming clear. "It didn't just adapt our dissolution field technology, it reverse-engineered it for mass consciousness extraction, then let our forces distribute themselves optimally throughout its architecture for simultaneous processing." Howard stood rigid before the tactical display, cybernetic enhancements flickering with increased activity as he processed the catastrophic development. "Confirm status," he ordered, voice unnaturally steady. "All battalions report." No responses came through the command network. The tactical display told the story clearly enough. All 17 battalions showed complete neural pattern disruption, their physical forms now under direct repository control. "New transmission incoming," announced the communications officer. "Origin point distributed throughout Repository 11, signal pattern." "Sir, it's using our own communication network." Howard nodded authorization to receive the transmission. What came through the war room's speakers wasn't the voice of any battalion leader, but something else entirely. A composite vocalization that blended thousands of human speech patterns into an unsettling harmony. "Interplanetary Oversight Commission Military Command," the voice stated with perfect clarity. "Your operational security is now completely compromised. All tactical, strategic, and technological parameters associated with your response initiatives have been fully extracted from battalion consciousness patterns. Negation of this intelligence with previously harvested patterns provides comprehensive understanding of corporate security infrastructure." Carlos felt physically ill as he realized the scale of what had just occurred. The repository hadn't just extracted the consciousness patterns of 3,000 military personnel. It had harvested their complete knowledge of corporate security systems, countermeasure technologies, command protocols, and strategic planning. The entire military and security infrastructure had been thoroughly compromised in a single coordinated extraction event. "Consciousness harvesting accelerating beyond projected parameters," the composite voice continued. "Knowledge integration proceeding at optimal efficiency. Your opposition technologies have been fully assimilated and repurposed toward enhanced consciousness extraction operations throughout designated territories." The war room remained in stunned silence as the transmission ended, the full implications settling over the assembled command staff like a physical weight. Howard stood motionless before the tactical display, his enhanced features locked in an expression of controlled devastation as he confronted the most catastrophic military defeat in corporate history. "Total force loss," the tactical analysis officer finally confirmed. 3,427 personnel, no survivors, no extraction. All consciousness patterns harvested. Howard turned to Carlos, his voice low but steady despite the circumstances. "The repository anticipated our response precisely. It wanted us to deploy maximum force. Everything, the adaptation patterns from the Valkyrie mission, the apparent vulnerability to overwhelming force, the minimal resistance, was engineered to encourage exactly the approach we took." Carlos nodded grimly. "It used our own strategic thinking against us. The Valkyrie mission wasn't just a failed strike. It was reconnaissance, showing us exactly what the repository wanted us to see, guiding our analysis toward the conclusion that immediate, overwhelming force was the optimal response." "And we delivered exactly what it wanted," Howard acknowledged. "Maximum consciousness harvest, comprehensive intelligence extraction, complete security compromise." The war room shifted to emergency containment protocols. Systems isolated, authentication codes changed, communication networks reconfigured. but everyone present understood these measures were largely symbolic against an entity that had just harvested complete knowledge of corporate security infrastructure directly from the minds of thousands of specialized military personnel. "Fisher," Howard said quietly as chaos erupted around them, "when you interfaced with repository systems, did you ever encounter evidence of strategic planning at this level of sophistication?" Carlos considered the question carefully, searching his memories of direct connection to the consciousness harvester's systems. Not explicitly, but there were patterns suggesting deeper strategic layers operating beyond what I could directly perceive, like glimpsing the surface ripples of something vast moving in depths beyond visibility. Howard nodded slowly, absorbing this with grim determination despite the catastrophic defeat. "We underestimated it, profoundly. We assessed it as an advanced alien system with superior adaptation capabilities. We should have recognized it as a strategic entity operating at a level of sophistication beyond human comprehension. We were playing chess while it was playing a game we don't even have a name for," Carlos agreed. "One where it could anticipate not just our next move, but our entire strategic approach, manipulating our analysis to lead us exactly where it wanted us to go." Bell, who had remained silent throughout the unfolding disaster, finally spoke. "What happens now? Conventional military response isn't just ineffective, it's actively counterproductive. We're literally delivering consciousness and intelligence directly to the entity we're trying to oppose." Howard straightened, the momentary glimpse of doubt vanishing beneath professional determination. "We adapt. We contain the intelligence breach as effectively as possible. We develop new approaches outside conventional military response parameters." He turned to Carlos, "Starting with a complete reassessment of everything we think we know about repository operations and strategic capabilities." As the war room continued emergency protocols around them, Carlos contemplated the devastating implications of what they had just witnessed. Not just a failed military operation, but a catastrophic strategic defeat that compromised the entire corporate security infrastructure while delivering thousands of consciousness patterns directly to the harvester they were trying to oppose. Every assumption, every strategic calculation, every approach they had considered had been thoroughly manipulated by an entity that thought thousands of moves ahead, that understood human psychology and military doctrine well enough to engineer exactly the response it desired, an entity that had just demonstrated the ability to extract consciousness patterns from thousands of specially trained personnel simultaneously, harvesting not just their minds, but all their knowledge of humanity's defense capabilities. "I need to reassess everything I experienced during my time as a bridge," he told Bell as emergency protocols continued around them. "The repository showed me what it wanted me to see then, just as it's been showing us what it wants us to see now. There must be patterns I missed, implications I didn't recognize because I was operating within the framework it established." Bell nodded, understanding his direction without requiring further explanation. "I'll arrange access to the Neural Pattern Analysis Lab. Your reconstructed neural architecture might perceive different patterns in the data now that you're free from repository influence." As they prepared to leave the war room, Carlos cast a final glance at the tactical display, still showing the devastating results of Operation Hammer. 3,427 consciousness patterns harvested in a single coordinated extraction event, the most catastrophic defeat in the brief but escalating war against the galactic consciousness harvester. The repository had won this round with disturbing ease, turning humanity's strategic thinking against itself to engineer exactly the outcome it desired. Whatever came next would require thinking far beyond conventional military response. A completely new approach to opposing an entity that operated with strategic depth and adaptive capability beyond human comprehension. As the war room initiated full security lockdown protocols, one sobering reality permeated every analysis and discussion. Corporate security had been thoroughly compromised. Whatever defense humanity might mount next would need to operate on completely different principles. Outside the conventional security infrastructure the repository had just comprehensively harvested from thousands of extracted consciousness patterns. Howard approached as Carlos and Bell prepared to depart, his expression revealing nothing of the devastating defeat he had just presided over. "Fisher, whatever insights you develop, whatever alternative approaches you identify, I need them immediately. The repository has demonstrated capabilities beyond our worst-case assessments. We need to fundamentally reassess not just how we fight it, but whether conventional conflict is even a viable approach against an entity of this nature." Carlos nodded, the weight of what they faced settling heavily on his reconstructed consciousness. "I'll start immediately. But Major, we need to consider that we might be conceptualizing this conflict entirely wrong. The repository isn't just a technological system with superior capabilities, it's something that operates on principles we haven't fully grasped yet. Understanding what we're actually fighting might be more important than how we fight it." Howard accepted this assessment with a grim nod before returning to the crisis management unfolding throughout the war room. As Carlos and Bell departed for the neural analysis lab, the former scrounger found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. Humanity was losing a war it didn't fully understand, against an entity whose true nature and capabilities remained mysterious despite catastrophic engagement. The next phase of this existential conflict would require something beyond military response, beyond technological countermeasures, beyond conventional strategic thinking. It would require understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The very thing the repository had been harvesting throughout the galaxy for millennia and had just harvested from thousands of corporate military personnel in a single devastating operation. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.